Okay. Does anyone have the list of questions open on their machine? Good, because my machine's locked up now. Let's just start with quick introductions and how to learn programming, right? Yeah. So quick introduction. Quick introduction and how you learn programming. We'll start with that for each of you. Hayley, go for it.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. My name is Hayley Pippin, and I'm the Senior Geoinformatics Fellow for the NASA Develop program. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Develop, we are part of NASA's Applied Sciences Capacity Building Program, and we do these rapid feasibility studies to test the applicability of remote sensing data to a variety of different environmental applications. And so as Senior Geoinformatics Fellow, I support all of the projects that we have in the program, and that can range from water resources to disasters, ecological forecasting, and I provide them with programming or just general technical support, and then help support the General National Program Office, as well as teaching coding workshops and other things like that. And the way I learned programming, I was actually really against programming early on in my career. Funnily enough, I tried to stay away from it, and I was really interested in math and not computer science at all. And then I eventually realized that it was going to be really helpful to me. So I took a class in R in college, and then ended up taking a class in Julia in my last semester, and figured out that it was really, really useful, and something kind of clicked in a way that hadn't before. And since then, I've just been kind of working on my own personal projects or using it in my jobs. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me and how I learned. Sarah, I'll pass it to you.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, so my name's Sara, and I work at a company called Panelists, and I head up a team called the Developer Relations team there. So if you've not heard of Planet Labs, basically we build tiny satellites that capture Earth observation imagery. We have a couple hundred of them in orbit at any given time. They're about this big. I don't know if you can actually see me on Zoom. They're about the size of a large loaf of bread or a corgi. And they weigh about as much as a corgi too. But basically we capture daily imagery of the Earth, the entire Earth's landmass every 24 hours, and then high resolution imagery of places on demand multiple times a day. But what I do is I head up a team, like I said, called Developer Relations, and we basically work on building tools and resources for anybody who's using Planet's platform with code in some fashion. So whether your title is software developer or not, maybe you're a GIS analyst or a GIS administrator, you want to pull in base maps to your QGIS map or add imagery to your ArcGIS workspace. Anyway, whatever you're doing, if you're engaging with our APIs or something, writing code, that's what my team tries to help you do better. So let's see, the other piece of that question, I think, was my own programming experience. I am a Python person. That is where my heart is. I love Python. I don't want to say how many years ago it was that I started programming, but it has been a while since I was in college. Originally, I started college going for a meteorology degree, then I switched to computer science, and then I ended up getting out with a combination of computer science and geography, which is how I landed in the GIS space. But I didn't start Python until, I want to say maybe 10 years ago, when I was working in GIS work and discovered that it made life so much better. And I can probably talk a little bit more about how it did that in a little while. But yes, I am here repping for the Python gang. And I'll pass it to Caitlin.
All right, hi everyone, and also good to see you, Hayley, and nice to meet you, Sarah. So I'm Caitlin. I am here at CSU working with the Geospatial Centroid. I'm the research and program coordinator is my official title. And I just started here over this past summer. My background is in conservation biology, and kind of getting into now how I learned how to program. First year of my PhD work, I started working in habitat suitability modeling, and we were using a colleague's code because they had automated it for these models for running over a bunch of species, which is what I wanted to do. And it was written in R. And so that is kind of how I got shoved into learning R. And I'm also kind of one of those weird people that's mostly entirely self-taught. But I just really took to it and really liked it. And then, so my dissertation work was a lot of spatial modeling, and that's how I got into this, GIS realm, and now working at the Centroid, where I work on a ton of different projects, not just conservation biology work. And so it's been really cool to work on new projects and new data and answer new spatial questions. But yes, I am repping for the R geospatial team.
Team R. All right, I found my questions. I'm good here. Thank you for introducing yourself. Quick note, if you're in the room, so let's just pass these down. There's dates on those cookies. So I don't think that I'm not bringing them home. Okay. So let's dive into some questions. We'll start out general and then dig in. So number one, what types of projects have you worked on? We'll start using. You kind of already mentioned that in your introduction. So I guess if you have anything different or unusual that you want to share about projects that you've worked on in that language.
I can go first. So in my role, I'm repping for both teams, in case you all didn't put that together, but in my role, I am able to interact with a lot of different types of projects. And I think there's honestly a lot of overlap in the projects that we do in R and Python. For instance, we do a lot of water resources projects looking at evapotranspiration data and trying to assess soil water levels. I think that we started moving some of our projects over to Python when we were building applications. So we recently did an urban heat vulnerability assessment project. And before we had to have it in R and another program in order to build this app. And then we transferred all of that over to Python so it could be entirely self-contained. So that was a big plus for that. But I think that the big takeaway is that there's a lot of overlap between the two, and it really is kind of based off of what your project needs are.
Yeah, and I was thinking, I don't remember exactly what you said, but you asked the question, you said something about other unusual projects we've worked on. And I was thinking about how Python, because I'm here for the Python folks, really lends itself to that sort of unusual project aspect. Now, it's incredibly useful for geospatial work or for data science in general. And there are lots of details I could get into on like what Python is good for in those respects. And I figure we'll dive into that in a minute. But another good thing about having Python in your own personal like programming toolbox is just that it's really simple to pick up, and just like you have a weekend project idea that has nothing to do with your day job, but you want to, I don't know, scrape all the emoji out of your favorite Slack or something. You just write a couple lines of Python and that'll do it. So it lends itself really well to those unusual projects without too much overhead, which is one of the things I like about it.
Caitlin, anything to add?
I guess with my experience, I've worked on kind of a wide range of projects that I think shows like the diversity of R and geospatial projects. So like I said, I did a lot of habitat suitability modeling. There's a lot of R packages for running those algorithms. I also did some landscape genomics work, was a chapter of my dissertation. So I actually did a bit of bioinformatics in R along with spatial genomic analyses and things like that. So that's kind of a unique one that I don't know if many people at the Centroid know either. I did some genetic work, and I did a lot of that in R. And then I also, on the note of building applications, that's something that I have been doing a lot in this new role, is building a lot of web applications in R using the R Shiny package. So yeah, it is also good for that. Although I will say there's one project I did have to switch to Python, and I'm learning how to use Streamlit and build Google Earth Engine app because there was a little hiccup of using it in R, but it wasn't that big. But yeah, so just kind of wanted to say there is a wide diversity of spatial analyses that I have been able to do all in R.
All right, thanks. And Steve has a question and comment from the chat. Do people like R because it's the first and only language they learned, or because they actually compared the two? Because there's only so much time to learn. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so R was the first language that I learned, and I went to it because it was told to me to be the easiest language to learn. And I also wanted to apply it to, when I was learning it, I was more interested in neurobiology and those like biological sciences. And that by far is used by a lot of like biologists a lot. And so I wanted to learn that. And then as I kind of like evolved in my programming, I realized that Python is, listed in so many more job postings. If you talk to someone, it's way more likely that they know Python than R. And so I realized I wanted to learn Python in order to, so I could, collaborate with people a lot easier, since that's kind of the more default language that people know. But in my comparison of the two, I still really prefer R for a bunch of different activities. Like I think data visualization, R is by far the best. It's really easy to make beautiful graphs and charts. And I also like it a lot more for kind of like fundamental data exploration. I think it's a lot easier to investigate a lot of different types of data structures in R. They have so many different options, and I find it to be a lot more intuitive than Python is. And I think especially if you don't come from a computer science background, R is a lot more approachable than Python is, which I think is usually more used more in by software engineers or developers or that type of profession.
All right. And Hayley, you mentioned that you think R is better for data visualization and data exploration. So for Sara and Caitlin, would you agree, or would you, based on the language that you know, would you say that's accurate?
As somebody here repping for the Python gang, my experience with R is limited to just playing around with it. So I have not used it in my work very seriously. That said, I agree with that, I think, because from what I know of it, from people that I know that work with it, that really is where it shines and where Python is more suited for like a lower level engagement with your data sets. It's not, I mean, you can do some things in Python with matplotlib for charting and graphics and display, but it's not the primary thing I would do with Python. I would use Python to like munch the data, prep the data, do something with it in the step that comes before the visualization. So I think I agree with the caveat that I'm just speaking from what other people have told me.
And I do also agree with that. Again, I am the R person, but there's like the USGS data science team. If you follow them on Twitter, they make so many really pretty visualizations, and most of them that's using R. The New York Times data viz team, I think, is all R, just because, yeah, it just has the capability to make really pretty visualizations to, oh yeah, BBC too. In order to make that high level, really pretty cartographic products or pretty visualizations, you do need to know quite a chunk of code. But another thing I like too is that like on Twitter and other, GitHub social media platforms, people make these really pretty visualizations and almost everyone always shares the code. So there's a big open access, atmosphere about it too.
So here's a question for Sara. So if Python is better for like the data work, where do you do your visualizations? Or is that not what you do?
No, that's a really good question. Probably 60% of my answer is that I don't. Despite the fact that I work with rasters every day, like that is my area of work. Like I don't visualize them all the time. That's for other people down the line. But a lot of visualizations that I do, to the extent of like displaying a histogram or maybe a heat map or an NDVI type thing, I use a couple different tools. And in the Python universe, there's a library toolkit package thing called Jupyter that you may or may not have heard of. And Jupyter notebooks are actually a really great way of writing Python because it lets you combine your Python code with the visualizations that you're outputting all in one browser window, basically. So I use that a whole lot. I use Jupyter very heavily when I'm doing something where I want to really quickly display the output of something or show the graph or the chart or the histogram. And notebooks make that really easy.
Any questions from the audience right now? I got more. All right. Okay. We'll go down the list. Thinking back to learning a language, we talked a little bit about how you began or like fell into the language that you learned, how would you rate the learning curve? And if you only know one language, you can't compare it, but how would you rate it? Try to be as objective as possible, and how easy it was to learn.
I'll go again. Let's see. I think the first language I learned long ago was Java. And so when I compare learning Python to learning that, Python is massively easier. It has a much more human approachable learning curve. I forget the quote. I think it's from the guy that made Python, but he says something about Python just fits your brain. As a human, it makes a lot more sense. It's more intuitive. But Java, I would not recommend as your first language if you've not programmed before. So I'd say Python's pretty approachable and human.
Okay, Caitlin?
Yeah, so R is the first language I ever learned. And I think a lot of people say this too. So it's hard for me to judge R versus Python, but a lot of people say once you've learned one language, it makes it a lot easier to learn others. And so I think that was kind of how it was for me. But I do agree that from when I've worked with Python, it does have a little more like human readability to it, I think, compared to R, but also like I've also been teaching R for like 5 years, and I think it's just very person dependent. I think like there's some people where it'll just click right away, and then others it takes longer. It's just like coding can be a very hard thing to just wrap your brain around. So yeah, I can't really judge Python versus R, I feel like, because once I intensively learned one, I think it kind of helped me learn others.
Yeah, good point. And then Hayley, do you have anything to add since you do know both?
Yeah, I would say R was easier for me to learn than Python for a couple reasons, in that with Python, there's a lot of different applications where you can run and write your code. Like Jupyter, Sara was mentioning, there's Visual Studio's code and Spider, Anaconda, like lots of different places. And it is pretty split among, I think, the community about what people prefer to use. Whereas R, pretty much everyone does it in RStudio. And so it's a lot easier in that there's one place where you're going to work and all the tutorials and documentation tell you how to do it in that place. I will add though that for both R and Python, there are so many different tutorials and resources out there to learn them. And I think programming is so dependent on the way that it's taught to you and what is easier to learn rather than the language itself. R and Python are both very readable, they're very approachable. And so if you feel like you're getting tripped up or stumbling, just move on to a different type of tutorial, because there's so many options out there, and it probably is that teaching style is just not working for you and a different one will.
That's great, thanks. Steve says, boo, typed languages like Java are good for complex projects. Programming in an IDE like RStudio, PyCharm, Visual Studio helps figure out typing. Yeah, so for those of you who know Python, there are a few of you in this room, what IDEs have you used? PyCharm?
Jupyter and Spider.
Jupyter and Spider?
PyCharm.
PyCharm, okay. And then on Zoom, Spider. All right. Yeah, I code in Python. I teach the class, so I think I know a little bit about it, but honestly, it's like I've been doing it for 18 years now, and I feel like I'm still not very good. Don't tell the people in my class. But we use PyCharm in class, and I find it pretty friendly. And RStudio I haven't really used, but I've done demos in it. But I feel like they're pretty comparable to each other. Okay.
Yeah, but I can see the difference with having like one main choice in R versus a bunch of choices in Python, where that could confuse somebody a little bit.
Yeah, when you're running the code, there's just a different interface to deal with, but it's all the same code.
Right.
Okay, so you all touched upon this a little bit, but the next question that I had in my list was talking about the documentation for R and Python languages and libraries. So all the help. So Hayley, you talked about tutorials, but what about general help for different libraries? I know for Python, my experience is that the documentation depends on the library, the package, like GDAL and Ogre versus GeoPanda is very different experience. So can you talk a little bit about that? Maybe Sarah, go first, since I was just talking about Python.
Sure, absolutely. So as somebody who, like I said, my team is called Developer Relations, and we do everything related to like education and enablement. So a large part of what we do includes docs for people who want to write code with satellite data in our case. So docs are a very huge part of my life. And I think the Python core docs, so the Python itself, not talking about any library that's not in the standard library, so a third party thing. But if you go to python.org, those docs I think are excellent as far as programming language documentation goes. And so I always kind of point people at them when they're like, how do I get started, or what should I read? I'm like, actually, the getting started tutorial on python.org is not bad. It's really good. But one thing I was thinking of a minute ago, in addition to documentation, if you're looking for like, what's the easiest way to learn, or how should I get started? The thing that really got me over the hump of finally picking up Python and making it my daily use language is just finding a problem in your regular work, an actual problem, not like a learning project, something that really drives you nuts in your current workflow, and try to figure out if you can apply whatever you're trying to learn to solving it. That's going to be, in my experience, like one of the best learning experiences, whether or not you're able to actually solve it, but having that goal that you're working towards, this thing that you want to fix, or this problem you want to solve, or something you want to figure out, that you're using the language that you're learning to work towards, like that's the most helpful thing, because then you know what you want to Google, like how do I use Python to do blah, blah, blah. And Googling is really the best part of the learning experience.
It's hard though. I have, as a teacher of beginners, a lot of beginners don't know what to Google. And so they'll type in a search and it won't get them anywhere close to the answer because the words they had were all wrong. And I think that's actually something really important to learn. I don't want to get sidetracked, but do you have any comments on good keywords, or how to learn what keywords to even search on?
Yeah, no, I love that question, actually. Like, learning what to Google is a significant part of the process. I forget who it was asked a few minutes ago, if time is limited, you can only learn one language. And I was thinking that that's completely true. Time is limited. One of the things that you'll gain, whichever language you decide to learn, R or Python, is more of that vocabulary that you didn't have before, as far as like what you're wanting to Google. And that's true for like any other language you want to pick up. Basically, you're learning the structure of the thing that you don't know, so that you can use other resources to fill in those blanks whenever you need it. Like, I'll never use Java again, but if I did, I know what to Google if I needed to pick it back up, for example. And that would be true for you, whether you pick up R or Python, in my opinion. But you asked me as far, actually, I'll let somebody else, I won't keep talking, but you were asking about like how to learn what to Google, and that's a great question.
Yeah, that could be a whole class in itself. Maybe we should have a lesson on that someday. Okay. Getting back to the documentation. So Caitlin, why don't you say a few words about R, and then Hayley, you can have a turn.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't, looked into Python library documentation as much, but on the R end, I do agree that I think it can be package dependent. But, like, for example, the tidyverse has incredible documentation. There's examples for everything. I would say it's packages that are just less popular and less used. The maintainers, I think there's less of a need to put more effort into the documentation. But also I've made my own R packages too, and on that end, they all have the common documentation structure, which is nice, and it also makes it easier on the developer end. When you initiate something as an R package, it kind of fills in like all the details you need. So for anyone that does build an R package, it's required that you have at least these certain criteria and documentation along with it. Yeah, I think generally for most R packages that I have ever needed to learn, the documentation has been really good. And I think a big thing too is having a lot of examples associated with it. Like sometimes I don't even read the real documentation. I just go down to the examples and see. That's, just seeing it in a line of code is like, okay, that's what I need.
All right. And then Hayley?
Yeah, one thing I like in R in the RStudio, you can just type like question mark and then the name of the package that you're looking at or function, and it just automatically pops up with documentation. And so that's like a really quick and easy way to look that up. But honestly, like I totally agree with Sarah. I spend a lot more of my time just Googling things because either the documentation will pop up, or if my question is not really addressed in the documentation, odds are someone has already asked it on like Stack Exchange or something like that. So in general, I just type my exact question into Google, like, how do I reverse the rows and the columns in this type of like data structure? And that usually leads me to Stack Exchange links. And I think those are like the most helpful. Like those post threads are so great because there's always like multiple methods for doing things and answering. So that's how I Google things generally. But yeah, Google definitely is the best.
Okay. And Sarah, you mentioned that most of your, well, not most, but you found the Python official documentation to be really helpful.
I did. I do. Yeah.
And then for R, so for Hayley and Caitlin, would you agree, or do you find that you're usually going to third-party like websites, Stack Exchange or whatever, for answers?
Yeah, oftentimes, if like I mentioned, I'll do like the question mark and then type in the function name or something, and the documentation will pull up. And probably like 75% of the time, I can answer my question through that. So I think overall, it's pretty helpful. But you know, like Caitlin was saying, I think examples are the most helpful. And so if there's an example that doesn't totally click for me, then I'll just go to a third party.
Awesome. So we have a question in the chat, so we can just bring it up. Allison asks, what's the difference between ArcPy and normal Python? I'll do normal in quotes. And since I'm not a panelist, I'll let Sarah answer. Or Hayley, if I don't know how much Hayley does with ArcPy, or Sara, even you.
So when I talked about learning Python to solve a problem, it was back in my Esri shop days. So I was writing a lot of ArcPy. Yes, people are answering it in chat for those in the room. ArcPy is a package that you import to interact with Esri stuff using Python. You need a license for ArcPy. Yes, if you don't have an Esri license, you can't do anything with it. If you're not using an ArcGIS thing, you can't do anything with it. Somebody else says it's the equivalent as QGIS is for QGIS. Yeah, but it's just a toolkit for interacting with Esri stuff specifically.
Yeah, think of it as primarily a way into all of the tools that ArcGIS can do, and then supplemental resources to do things like accessing data, listing data, getting to properties, getting into tables, accessing data values in a table, a number of other things too. But yeah, it's all about Python for ArcGIS.
I will also say there's also the same thing for R. So the R ArcGIS bridge, I forget what the package exact name is. But like I think a lot of people always think of as it's always Python Esri, you know, but there are options. I'm forgetting what the package name is, because personally I haven't ever had to use Esri's tools as much, because I've found, you know, most of what I need to do is also available in R.
Yeah, and to get into the open source versus Esri argument, that's quite a battle royale in and of itself. Todd Barr, for those of you who know Todd Barr, they are make fun. I guess I use the word make fun of ArcPy as being like the most non-Python way to learn Python. Todd has very strong opinions on Esri, but it can still do a lot. Doug, what do you think?
Sarah said that too.
Oh,
That was
yes,
really, yeah.
totally.
I was gonna say that was really diplomatically put. Well done.
There's a lot, yeah. So it really depends on like what type of Python you want to do. Todd considers it ArcPy like not even doing Python. I think it counts. I think it counts. So yeah, there's a whole big discussion on it. All right. Any questions from here? Yeah.
So Python has seen a lot of like large scale introduction and adaptation in like the web mapping services and everything. And at that scale, according to like a report from the University of Minho in Portugal, Python uses some of the most energy per other programming. Now, when it comes to that large scale deployment, do you think R could potentially fill that niche and help lower the energy consumption of these programming languages?
Were you able to hear that?
At all?
Okay, so he's far away. So is R potentially more efficient than Python?
Yeah, and can it fill that niche of larger scale deployment instead of just being?
Any thoughts on that one? That's a tough one.
Sorry.
I would just like to say that I've honestly never heard that. I didn't know that Python was more energy efficient, really. I've just never really thought about it. But I don't know, being someone who is the R programmer, I think that the options there are kind of limitless. Like, I think it is, you could totally be a geospatial analyst that only knows R. I almost am one of those. I do a little dabbling in other stuff, but that's more just out of interest sometimes. But yeah, so I think my answer is yes.
I think that's a really interesting question. I've also never heard anybody exactly talk about the energy efficiency of one language over another. I think though, when you get to the level of trying to decide the energy efficiency of the programming language in use, there's so many other factors and trade-offs that you're going to want to consider before deciding should I use Python or R to save a kilowatt hour or something. And I think that there's so many other things that would actually have an impact that you're probably going to end up spending more energy trying to make that decision than just using whatever fits the task best.
So Sarah, it looks like, oh no, Hayley, sorry. Hayley has a question if you want to read through that. We can answer that in a moment. Any other questions from the audience?
So I don't know if it's in Python, but I know in R you can rewrite chunks of it in like C++ or more base languages to run more efficiently. But there, yeah, it's on the scaling up question. But
You can compile Python or rewrite it and see.
Yeah, okay. So I don't know if you could hear that. So we're talking about how you can compile Python and convert to C. So what can R do in that respect? So I'm trying to read the chat.
oh yeah, R can also.
Yeah, okay.
I kind of heard in and out, but I like, yeah, what Barb says in her comment, R can also do the same thing. I will agree that R can be very slow with big spatial data. Those are the rare times I've had to call on Esri for help. But there also has been a huge overhaul and improvement in these packages and their efficiencies. Like, if anyone knows, the R packages, raster and SP are kind of the OG spatial packages in R, but now those are actually getting retired and they're shifting to new spatial packages, SF and Terra. SF works really well with the tidyverse data structure, and the operations are generally a lot faster. And then Terra is the updated version of raster, and it performs raster operations a lot faster than the raster package did. And I also wanted to chime in on the Julia comment. Hayley, I'll let you answer it, but I have also used Julia a bit and I loved it. If anyone has ever worked or heard of CircuitScape for connectivity modeling, there's a new version of it that's available to run in Julia, and it is 1,000 times faster than the previous version was. I just wanted to chime in there that Julia is a very new language, but I think it's growing rapidly just because its processing power is wonderful. And there's also, like, I've seen new documentation for making web applications in Julia, and so it's starting to evolve these libraries that will allow it, equivalent functionality as R and Python.
Yeah, what I would say about Julia, I loved Julia when I learned it. I thought it was so awesome because it came out of MIT and it was designed to have the approachability and ease of use of Python, the statistical power of R, and then the speed of C. Or C++, I don't remember. But so it's supposed to be like the best of all the different types so that it can do anything that you want pretty much. And I thought it really did that super well. And unfortunately, I haven't used it in a few years because it is really new and not a lot of people use it. And so I'm a little out of practice, but I would love to see it. I'm really happy it's expanding. I would love to see it more widely used. And so I think that it's a good secondary language to learn at this point in time, though, because it isn't really what I just started to see some job postings where it was using Julia, which was awesome. But I think in general, if you're trying to market your skills and be strong in the geospatial world, then R, Python are definitely a much better choice. But then, in your free time, if you can learn that as well, I think, and then figure out how to do a lot of these common R or Python operations in Julia, that's like a huge area of expansion, and you could really be like a leading researcher in that too.
All right, so kind of going on what you just said about marketability and what language to learn for certain types of things, we talked a little bit about visualization already, and that R seems to be the winner maybe in that category. What about other things like, and I have a big long list, so get ready. We'll do it one at a time. Just your normal geospatial analysis. What do you think? R or Python in terms of packages, performance, ease of use? You're all thinking, I can see. I'm gonna make Caitlin go first.
I mean, like I said, what was that?
I know you can only speak about R, but just give it like a ranking.
For general geospatial things, R, like I mentioned, the SF and now the Terra package, originally the raster package, I still use a ton. I thought it was very easy to use. The documentation was really good. There was a function for almost, every spatial tool that, the Esri world has. I will say the one thing I have, which is kind of the reason I've used Python more, is with Google Earth Engine things. There is the R Google Earth Engine package, which I've also used and is also nice, but it's kind of, the setup is kind of clunky because it's actually using the Python API because there's not an R API. So yeah, that is one thing I have found Python, and there's a lot more documentation, I think, for using Python and Google Earth Engine. So in general, geospatial technologies and analyses, that's where I do think Python is a little better right now.
Okay, from the R person herself. All right, Sara or Hayley?
I mean, I'm biased because I'm going to say Python anyway, but Python. But no, when I'm doing any GIS analysis type work, I'm almost 100% using Python libraries, Rasterio and Fiona, which are basically GDAL and OGR with a more Pythonic interface. But that's what I use like all the time for anything. And then on the rare occasions that I need to visualize something for analysis, then I would just use QGIS.
Okay.
Yeah, and I honestly do a lot of my geospatial analysis in Google Earth Engine. And so in that way, I would vote Python just because that integration is so good, and R just doesn't have that. So I vote Python there, but I think like for spatial statistics and like making nice looking maps, I like R for that.
All right, well, statistics was on my list as well. So we'll keep going. Data science, statistical types of things. Caitlin or Sara, what are your thoughts on Python or R?
I mean, I think, R was designed as a statistical language. So I think the statistical abilities are really strong there, especially, I'm an ecologist, and I think ecologists generally, at least from my experience, use R a little more because of the statistical analysis capabilities. And there's a lot of packages that allow for really intense, community analyses and things like that. And with the tidyverse, which I'm a huge fan of, I think that it makes data science and R really amazing with just, one giant library of multiple libraries. You can do everything from importing the data, cleaning it, tidying it, visualizing it, and then also sharing and reporting, I think is another, with our Markdown in Knitter, I think is a really cool thing that R offers.
All right. Sara, anything to add on data science stuff?
No, I don't have much to add on to this one.
Okay, well then we'll start with you for the next one. My next one was remote sensing operations.
Oh, hugely biased towards Python. I mean, again, you're going to get biased answers out of me. I'm sorry, but yeah, everything I do in my daily job for the last couple of years at Planet is all remote sensing. I will say prior to Planet, I was a vector only geo person, like a lot of folks out there. So I don't know, my answer might have been different if you'd asked me like 4 or 5 years ago, but definitely Python for raster work.
But you can do all the things that you need to do, heavy duty, hardcore, whatever, advanced, sophisticated remote sensing, all with Python. And
Yes.
what library?
Now I'm like, wait, maybe I'm lying to you.
Maybe I hyped it up a little too much, I don't know.
Primarily Rasterio, or if you prefer using GDAL directly.
Okay, no, I don't. And then Hayley, do you have any comments? Do you do a lot of remote sensing?
Yeah, I do. And then again, like I mentioned, I do a lot of my work in Google Earth Engine. And so I built Python because of that. And so it's easier to integrate. Also, one thing I wanted to add on the data science and statistics side, which is a point for Python, is that I think there's a lot of like a big trend towards like machine learning and deep learning and using those techniques in like different remote sensing analysis and environmental analysis. And I think Python has a lot more robust packages for that. And so if that's an area that interests you, I would suggest learning Python over R.
Okay, thank you. And Caitlin, do you do much remote sensing?
No, I don't think as much as Hayley and Sara do. But the stuff that I have had to do recently in Google Earth Engine, like I said, it's kind of the reason I started using Python more. It just connected well better than the R package does.
Okay. The next category I had was temporal data, time series, animations, maybe. Have you had experience using those in your languages of choice?
I say that R is very good with time series data. I've used it in my work. I just know a lot of ecologists that work with time series data, and a lot of people use R. I've also, Beth, you've seen, I've made, the cool animations with time series and movement data. And as far as I know, R has all the cool packages that make it really easy to do that and deal with it. I have not done that. Tried it in Python. So,
Hayley or Sara, have you ever needed to do that in Python? Do you know if there are things for that?
I think I have not used it in Python. Most of our developed projects do time series analyses or like animations in R. It might just be because that's where our science advisor's expertise lies. And so they just know exactly how to do that. But I would agree with Caitlin on this one. I would vote R.
All right. We got some Python, we got some R. The last thing on my little list here was working with web services and accessing, online data. Obviously, both languages can do it. Is there any difference in ease of use or limitations?
I tell everyone there's an R package for any type of data set that you want to import. Is that kind of what you're getting at, like connecting to online databases and stuff?
Exactly.
Yeah, like we gave this presentation earlier with the CLTL group, and I was just talking about getting data, and there's a package for getting NOAA data. There's the R NOAA package. There's the R Natural Earth package. There's Tidy Census to get census data. I don't know if there is Python equivalents, but like any open access database, there is an R package. It's basically just the database name with an R before or after it. It's really easy to import it directly in R and work with it in R, and you don't have to, you can save it in a temp directory. You don't have to actually download it to your personal computer. And that's the R side. But again, I don't know what the Python side is.
I think it's definitely something you can do easily in Python, just interacting with web services in general. And I think this one, I will back down a little bit from my like rah Python all the way and just say, when you're at the point of deciding what to use to interact with web services and APIs, you just use whatever fits the rest of the project you're doing, because that's usually one piece of a project.
All right. Kevin, who is a Geospatial Centroid Morgan Library, has a really good question. Do you think one language is better than the other for research reproducibility?
I'm going to leave this question alone because I am not an academic, so I couldn't tell you what would be a good answer.
And Caitlin's face says, not really.
I think just, making your stuff open access, and, R and Python are both great at that. And that's kind of the open access movement. I think everyone is on the same page there. I don't think one is better than the other.
Okay. Any questions? I do have one. Wait, we're running low on time. We have a couple minutes left. Doug?
Yeah, I'm wondering if Hayley has specific recommendations on visualization tools for Python that make it as nice as R.
That's a good question. I mean, like I mentioned, I do most of my visualizations in R because I think it's better for that. I mean, I think like, you know, Matplotlib, people do most of they use that a lot for their Python visualizations. And there's all sorts of like customizations that you can do with that. So I would say that's where I would start. And honestly, I find a lot of luck of like perusing through people's GitHubs and looking at their example, like charts that they've made or something. And oftentimes they'll have the code that you need to recreate it. So off the top of my head, I can't think of like anything specific except to look up the Python programmers who are making really beautiful visualizations, and odds are they'll have at least snippets of their code that you need to do that.
Thank you.
On that note, if anyone is, you know, active on Twitter, April is the 30-day chart challenge. And so if you look up that hashtag there, it's basically each day there's a different theme or category, and people are just making these really beautiful data visualizations. And a lot of them, the people, so if you did like 30-day chart challenge and like hashtag Python, because people will say, I made it in RStats, I made it in Python, and a lot of them have links to the Git repo with the whole code used to make that chart. So I have found that as like an inspiring, you know, resource for seeing different types of visualizations that you can make in different languages and libraries. And oftentimes people also share the code they used to make it.
All right, thanks, Caitlin. Last question, and we'll do that poll again for whoever can stick around for a second. In terms of disciplines and industries, and this is one that I would like those of you online, I think we have like 40 people online, put it into the chat, and the panelists I'd like to enter too, but what disciplines and industries do you see most commonly used with one or the other? So Caitlin, I think, or Hayley mentioned ecology before, that ecologists often use R because of the statistics and those types of visualizations. Are there other disciplines that are typically one or the other? And feel free to put your ideas in the chat as well. Barb says R for statistics, which makes sense. Any thoughts? Caitlin, Hayley? Like, I know here in the Warner College, we have a Fish and Wildlife Conservation Biology Department. Kyle Horton, Mevin Hooten, like they live in R. Matt Ross, who's a hydrologist, he lives in R. Like Python, oh no, get away from me. So there are people who in their little niches, they only do the one. And they don't think that the other one should even be bothered learning. Talk to Matt Ross, that's how it seems. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. Steve says R seems to be what recent graduates are learning. This can be challenging at work where we use Python more. So is there a disconnect between academia and the real world?
I think that R often is used more in academia. That's not to say Python is not used, because Python is widely used in academia as well. But in general, I associate research a little bit more with R than Python. And Python, I associate a lot more with like software engineering, developing like more of that like workplace use. Like Steve was mentioning, they use Python at their work. So I'd say that's a bit of a difference. And, you know, I mentioned earlier, but like biological sciences, like a lot of that is very R based. But there's many fields where both are used, like data science, you can use both of them, like analysis, both are great. So.
All right, I'm gonna throw that poll up here and then I'll let you guys go. We have one more poll. Which one is it? Hold on. I have two. Oh no. Okay, well, I guess we're not, the poll was the same question as from the beginning. It just didn't get saved. So now that we're at the end, what do you think is a better language to use, R or Python? Or it depends. Yeah, Anytime my students in GIS ask me, what's the best blah, 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 or which ones did you use for blah, blah, blah? I'm like, it depends. So I think that's the takeaway from here, but at least we have kind of a little list of where R shines versus Python may shine. So with that, I will let you all go because it's after 4:50. If the panelists can stick around for a couple minutes, if there's any final questions to wrap up, we'll stick around on Zoom here, but thank you for coming. Take a cookie or some grapes because I don't want to bring them home. Thank you. Oh, and if you're interested, the Geospatial Centroid is having an open house on Wednesday from 1 to 4. Our website is gis.colorado-state.edu. You can get all the info there and you'll just come, meet us, see what we do, learn about our projects. Come Wednesday, 1 to 4. For you guys too. All right. Any final questions that you want to ask the panelists? I'm going to stop recording now too.